What I want to share with you today is just about 4 hours worth of information in 20 to 30 minutes. And I think when I thought about the title for what is sharing, it's really what God has done in Bibles for Asia. And so I'm going to start out by just sharing that it's been a miraculous journey for 14 years on what God has done. And I named it God Provides and Souls Saved. Because if it were up to me, I think that it would have been chaos. But God brought the people, the organizations, the team members, the workers, the volunteers, every single thing that happened was because I know people prayed, people surrendered to the Lord, and God took lives and used them to reach literally tens of thousands for Christ, especially the last 5 to 7 years. But when we were called into this ministry, my wife had passed away from cancer, and I taken care of her for 11 years. And I wondered, what am I going to do with the rest of my life at age 65? And so I just turned 80 last month, and I thought, well, Lord, how can you use somebody at 65? I'm over the hill, as my daughter-in-law said. And so I thought about this, and we went up, and some of you know Frank Shatner and his wife Jan from William Jessup, and Jan was Bryce Jessup's daughter. And we went up to Frank's house about 14 years ago, and we had a lunch there with our Bible study group that had been praying, and a group from our church at Sunrise Community. Back then it was Sunrise Baptist. And so what happened was I'd asked Frank and stuck my foot in my mouth, and if you've heard me say this before, bear with me, but I said, Frank, what else can we do besides pray and a little support, to help you in the ministry you're doing in Asia? And he looked at me with a look, and I knew I was in trouble with Frank right then and there. And he said, do you really mean that? I says, Frank, I don't like the look in your eye. And I'll never forget that lunch meeting that we had. Because he said, I need somebody to smuggle Bibles into communist countries. I said, yeah, right, Frank. I said, that's a little dangerous, isn't it? And so, anyway, at the end of that meeting, Joy and I, and digressing a little, that my best friend, who worked with me for years, who's now with the Lord, he introduced me to Joy the year after my wife passed away. And it ended up till we'd been going to the same church for almost 25 years and never saw each other and met each other. Can you believe that? I mean, I was involved in teaching children and young married couples and working a lot and being a caregiver for 11 years. And so God opened up the door. Joy and I were challenged. And what does a person say when God challenges you to do something that you're a little afraid of, feel unqualified to do, and not sure this was what you even wanted to get close to? You say, well, I got to go home and pray about that, right? And we hear a lot of people say, well, I got to pray about that when they're asked to do something to serve the Lord. Well, we got in the truck and left Frank's house after that meeting, and we weren't down the road 10 minutes, and I looked over to Joy and I said, we don't have a clue what Frank's talking about, what to do and everything. But I called Frank back and said, Frank, you've got two people that are really unqualified here, but we want to find out what you had in mind and how in the world would we get started? What would we do to serve the Lord like that? And he said, well, I've got my friend Lou. And he said, Lou, has worked with me for about 20 years, and he'll teach you what to do. Well, that was the beginning. We started recruiting about 22 people. 9 of them had deaths in the family, illnesses, lost their jobs, all sorts of things. But 13 of us went to China, went to Hong Kong, met people there that had a warehouse and an apartment and office who had been hauling Bibles into China for 25 years. And so they said, we'll teach you what to do. Well, the first week of being in Hong Kong, God really blessed, and our team of 13 hauled about 6,000 Bibles into China in about 5 or 6 days. And that got us all excited about, wow, look at the people we're going to reach with the gospel. And then we would fly down to Vietnam and haul suitcases of Bibles down there to Saigon, go back to Hong Kong, load up suitcases again, haul them to Hanoi, and meet with contacts in these countries that were arranged and hand off the Bibles. So that's what we really did, was mainly Bibles, and we got connected with Bible printers in many different countries, and they would donate Bibles to the organization and get us started. And we worked with other teams and team members, and God just grew it all. But we found out after about 3 years, we said, well, how do we know really what good those Bibles are doing? And how do we know they're going to people? Because we'd also learned in about 3 years that half the people we met couldn't read. And so I said, giving people a nice Bible is great, but if they can't read, we found out from different mission organizations and we'd go into villages, and sometimes Bibles were used to prop up tables and things like this. And, it's just, but if you can't read, you just think, well, I've got that book. And people thought that book would save them. Just the book. But they didn't know how to read it. And so we connected through, again, amazing story with Global Recording Network and audio recordings. And so they started giving us CDs, and we started duplicating those CDs and entered an agreement with them to use their materials, use their scripts. That, after a few years, we began doing our own recording work, and that started. And I'll tell you what's happened in the last 4 years. During COVID, the ministry grew 500% the last 3 to 4 years. And we don't know. I'm only giving you an approximate relayed message from our key contacts in China that basically they said, you've probably started with everything you've hauled in. And to go back a little further, in 4 to 5 years, all of our teams together, all of them, hauled about 1.2 million Bibles just into China, a couple of 100,000 into Vietnam. And so things were good. We had publishers and different denominations that were donating 100,000 to 250,000 Bibles a year that were at our disposal. And so, but then we met a guy that made gospel coins in 119 languages. And so, which happens to be the number of languages now in Vietnam. And so we had Vietnamese, 6 different languages for India, and on and on and on. And so we would distribute these in Asia countries. And I went to teach at a Bible school in India for a while, and with another pastor friend, and we started hauling Bibles, audio players. But we didn't start out with audio players when we got into the recordings. We basically were recording and putting things on CDs. Then we went to microchips. Then we went to where the Jesus Film organization and their distributor, the Mariah Krause, him and his wife, they ended up saying, well, look at, how many Jesus films do you need? And so we ended up getting thousands of Jesus films in DVDs and CDs with audio, and those we would take up. And then we started meeting village pastors. And so from China to Vietnam to India, then things started growing a little bit the last 4 years, where we put things on flash drives, on microchips, and we would take them into contacts, and they would take them into Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, and things kind of grew into about 8 nations the last 6 years. Well, what's happened is, as best we can tell from the records, because when you're working in communist countries, one thing that's a little tough is getting people to write, if they know how to write, and how to do a report and get you even a photograph, because probably almost everybody in this room has a smartphone. In a village of, say, 100 families, they may have one person with a dumb phone, the analog type, but it's very rare. In 3-4 villages, if you'll find somebody with a smartphone. Well, that's changed the last 3 or 4 years, even during COVID. And so everything is now microchip, downloaded onto telephones, with all the transfer and digital and electronic things that are available. It's just been an amazing journey. And we figure that we probably were a part, and I just say a part because there's always a lot of people involved. I mean, we were mainly the mules. We hauled the stuff in, especially the first 6-7 years. But now we started developing relationships, and people said, we never thought you'd come back. We never thought we'd see you again. But all of a sudden, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years went by, and we started developing contacts and establishing trust with these people in these villages and the village pastors. And even though I couldn't speak all their different languages, today we're working with people in about 40 different languages. And it's just, but God's blessed. We figured, boy, we need translators. Well, I ended up having the privilege of marrying our director in Vietnam to an SIL graduate translator, does work for Wycliffe and so forth. And so married them here March 25th of this year, and what a blessing. God has taken that couple and just, now we've got 2 full-time translators on our Vietnam staff, but they're doing work in Thailand, Cambodia, for Laos, because a lot of the languages, not a lot, but enough, a few dozen languages are similar, mostly 80% or so, in like Thailand, Cambodia, southern China, and a lot of the evangelist teams, God blessed. And I could sit here, and if I had my prayer journal with me, I could read off answers to prayer until midnight on what God has done. And one of the things is we've got now about 4,000 workers in Asia. And they're not all full-time. We've only got about maybe 1.5 dozen to 2 dozen that are full-time coming and going. But a lot of these people, working with the Christian Missionary Alliance, working with the Hanoi Bible College, working with the Christian Evangelical Vietnam Association in South Vietnam, and it's just, God's opened up the doors with evangelical church denominations and mission organizations that have just, you talk about God providing. He says, we wondered, well, the last couple of years, Lord, how can we get into other countries where people can't read, the least reached, the unreached? How can we get these recordings in audio to people who can't read, people that have bad eyesight, people that are blind, people uneducated? How can we do that? Well, God's opened up the doors. And so in the last 2 years, we developed a program with Global Recording Network to go into 30 countries over the next 10 years. And we're hoping we can do it in 5 or 6. But again, it's God's timing. It's God's way. We just want to be where God wants us to be and be the mules, be the servants, and just reach people with the very simple gospel message. And I'm going to share some things with you because there's so much to share. It's just two of our key verses that you all know, Matthew 28, 19 and 20. What are we to do? To go. Preach the gospel. Teach them to obey. But that teaching them. And so when we started out, we didn't have a teaching ministry. Now we've got about 16 people that are teaching. And so the Christian Missionary Alliance said, we want you to come and train our 400 evangelists how to use your audio evangelism gospel training program and teach it to our roughly, 2,500 to 3,000 pastors and church leaders just in North Vietnam. And so we've got another organization in South Vietnam, the same thing. But they also go into Cambodia, go into Laos, go into southern China. They have people from the Philippines come over. And so the fingers are opening up. And God's opened up some doors to where, Lord willing, I'll be in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines here in October, November, coming up next month, leaving, as well as Thailand and Vietnam. And it's just, God's really opening up the doors. And it's exciting because we're thinking, boy, Lord, we need more teachers, we need more translators. You need more, right? I mean, how do you reach people? I mean, now all of our teams in Asia, they're starting about 300 gospel audio listening groups per month. They're leading 2,000 to 3,000 people per month to Christ. And I'm thinking, Lord, how can we adopt, modify, simplify, whatever message of how it's being done there and bring it back to America to reach America and bring America back to Christ, from the government down to the immigrant. And so we've got the tools. And we went from just audio speakers where you stuck a microchip in, and just to tell you what does it cost for these speakers, and we progressed from just plain speakers to audio players that we program, and we can put in there the whole Bible or the New Testament, up to a year's Bible teaching on 8 gigabyte cards, and we can have Bible teaching to go in with our facilitator into a village once we've led someone to Christ, or not just lead them to Christ, but in the first 60 days, our program teaches a brand new Christian how to share the gospel, share the good news, and invite that person into that village gospel listening group to also be taught God's Word. And so another miracle happened last year in Vietnam. We went to the government and said, we want to start a Bible school. They said, what name do you want to use? I said, well, Vietnam for Jesus. I said, oh, no, we can't have Vietnam for Jesus. We're a communist country. And they said, well, you got another name? I said, well, how about Bibles for Asia? They said, well, we'll accept that one. And so, we got a business license in Saigon for Bibles for Asia School Limited. And so, so God opened that up. And we started training people and in how to use a computer, how to use the audio, how to basically share the gospel, how to start and facilitate a audio gospel listening group in a village. And so, we started out just with Vietnamese language, and then from Vietnamese we translate it and get people to where now we've got our gospel listening groups in 20 some odd languages and in audio, and we are now producing about 5,000 microchips a month. And these microchips are all in different languages, and we're working on translations right now with SIL on a couple of the New Testament translations. It's just, there's so much going on, I'll tell you. I'm almost to one point which I want to tell you ahead of time. Start thinking about who you know who wants to haul Bibles, be a leader, be a volunteer, join a team, we need leadership, administration. One, we want someone to take over running United States operations. We want someone to take over running Asia operations. Then we want someone to be in on the ground floor to help going into every continent in the next 10 years, Lord willing, if we're all still here. If not, we'll be caught up and leave everything behind, right? And hope somebody uses it.
Would you jump off on when he started about what you're doing for children?
Well, this is another neat thing that happened about children's ministry. Now that you mentioned it, hitchhike on your devotional. Well, what happened, I met a couple of years ago a wonderful lady, and her name's Mrs. Lang. And we've got her story on our summer news that we just came out with a month or two ago over here. And I want you to know a couple of things. Number one, Mrs. Lang, who's about early 60s, she led our Vietnam director and his family to Christ about 22 years ago. And his brother and sister, the whole family. Well, lo and behold, Mrs. Lang tells me a couple of years ago, she said, you know, I really want to do more in serving the Lord. And I said, well, Mrs. Lang, tell me about your life. She said, well, have you got time to sit here and hear my life testimony and what God's had me doing the last 40 years? I said, sure. So she told me how, as a young girl, she came to know Christ, how she started making little puppets, because you see in Asian countries, and in many foreign countries, they love puppetry. And you know, like in Vietnam, they've got what they call water puppet theaters, where you go in and they've got these puppets that it's a flooded area, and these puppets are like they're coming out of the water, and they all tell a story about the water buffalo, about the fishing, about the history and the lives in these water puppet deals. Well, Mrs. Lang got that idea almost 40 years ago. And when she became a Christian, she said, how can I reach more people with the gospel? She started making puppets because that was a national traditional thing. And so she made these little handmade puppets, sewed them and the whole bit, and she would put on telling Bible stories with the people dressed up in these costumes that people could relate to. And so she started the puppet ministry, then a children's ministry, then VBS's. And so then she started training others to do this, training teachers. And she traveled all over in 60-some provinces of Vietnam with her puppet ministry and child evangelism work. Well, 2 years ago she decided, she says, you know, God's put it on my heart. I don't want to retire. I want to go full-time with Bibles for Asia. Now Mrs. Lang is our director of children's ministries. And they went out 3 months ago with the VBSs going 1 to 2 to 3 days in villages, into 30 some odd villages, leading 700 children and their families to Christ. Just from the puppet ministry and Mrs. Lang and her half a dozen helpers. And so her story about her life I won't get into. Very interesting. I could write a book about just her life because the communists have raided her home so many times back 20, 30, 40 years ago. Things were not easy. They're a lot easier today than they were. But still, people disappear, people get arrested, and I've been in villages where the police showed up and pointed to me and said, "What's he doing here?" And get him out of here. And we just finished a prayer meeting in a little village church, and we'd gone by motorbike across this river to where that remote little village was, and met with 8 pastors and prayed with them, and took them some Bibles and audios and so forth. But the police told them clearly, tomorrow morning I want all of you pastors at the police station. And And then I didn't hear from these pastors for months. And I thought, man, were they put in prison? Were they tortured? What happened? You know, because I could write a lot of stories about those who have disappeared. And several of our staff people that are volunteers with us over there, they've got the scars on their faces from being beaten and tortured, and several have not survived even in the last 5 years. And so it's just half the provinces in Vietnam in the north are very strict. Half of them are a little more lenient today. But the only Christian church that has full, almost unmonitored from the Communist Party is the Christian Missionary Alliance. And they built the first Christian mission church in Hanoi in 1902 or 1904. And God kind of brought us together with them over the last 4 years. And in fact, they'd even printed Bibles and gave to us that they shipped to us that we hauled into Vietnam over the last probably 4, 5, 6 years. But all of this is said to where the Christian youth evangelism is alive and well in Vietnam. And for 2 months, they traveled. And you talk about commitment. Mrs. Lang's husband had a brain hemorrhage about a month before. In fact, it was actually, I think it was the day before the wedding of Timothy and Prairie. And he went into the hospital. He ended up going into a coma, had a brain hemorrhage, and the doctors gave up after about a month and said, there's nothing we can do, you have to take him home. And so she took him home, and a week later, he passed away. 3 days after he passed away, they're sending me pictures of the funeral and the burial and all this. And 3 days after they buried him, she's heading out with her team because of her commitment to Christ to reach these children in these villages with commitments they made and scheduled to go have their summer camp VBS. And so it's just, the children's ministry is thriving. And it's going from just VBSs in the summer to where now, by December, it's going to be going full-time with a full-time staff. And she has already developed and trained over the last 15 years some wonderful people. And if we can get my computer to work with that screen, you'll see a little 1 or 2 minute video of some of these things I'm telling you. I'm going to go back about 2 to 3 years, and you'll see some slides, because like they say, the picture's worth 1,000 words. If you can take a look and we can maybe just kind of take 3 seconds, 4 seconds per slide so you can read it and understand it. But to see about God's blessings and our people in Vietnam that have been trained, we've already got about 24 of them that said, we want to go wherever you go. We will go to the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. They said, we'll go. They said, just teach us what to do. And so God's raising up the people. This is our vision and mission statement for Bibles for Asia. Number 1, accomplishing the Great Commission of Christ, which you all know, evangelism and Christian education. Because the one thing we found, if you lead people to Christ, if you don't disciple them, if you don't teach them, you lose them. And it's just most of them. And so we've been developing curriculum over the last 4 years that we're now using in our Bibles for Asia school. And we're also training people out in villages where people will travel on foot or by motorbike 5 to 30 miles to get to our teaching sessions where 20 to 40 people meet to be taught. Next slide. But this gives you some of the ministries of what is happening. We now have about 14,000 gospel audio listening groups, all total. And some of our facilitators of a gospel listening group are out 3, 4, and 5 nights a week conducting training of 10 to 60 people in each group who are new Christians. And a lot of times there may be a third to half of them who are not even Christians yet. They're coming because they've got questions and they want to hear the story that their grandparents have told them about Noah and the ark. I mean, even in Vietnam and China, the stories about Noah and Moses are still handed down through these tribal villages and people. Next slide, please. Global Recording Networks has been a tremendous partner. We've got a good memo of understanding with them as a partner, and 16 of us went over to Thailand to their Chiang Mai Training Center last October and November to train more of our recordists and specialists in translation, script writing, cultural research, and developing our audio scripts that we use to produce in the different languages, the gospel, what they call the look, live, and listen, Bible stories, words of life, basic Bible teaching. Next slide, please. This is from Global Recording and their main office that they moved from Temecula over to Tucson, Arizona, here the last couple of years. Next slide, please. And this is, they went and bought one of the major building facilities from SIL Mexico in Wycliffe. Well, so we got teamed up with SIL, and now that one of their graduates got her master's degree in translation, married Timothy here, and now we've got our own in-house connection with SIL, which is a blessing. You talk about God providing, because now we've got 6 more translators in Thailand that want to come over and join our teams and help us in Vietnam. IHU is an online Christian teaching for bachelor's, master's, and doctorates. And I worked with them for a couple of years in developing their online program of leadership and Bible teaching. And after, I think, reading 100 books and reading back and having to do a Bible report on every book of the Bible, it took me about 2 years, but at my age, I didn't think this would ever happen, but I got my master's degree in Christian education because I figured I better get a little more knowledge here if we're going to be opening up Bible schools in different countries. Next slide. Well, that's one of our theme verses and our purpose. Go ahead, I'm going to just have you roll through some of these because I wanted to show you this to give you a little bit of idea about our doctrinal statement, our mission, our vision. It's real simple. Share the gospel, teach them God's word, to multiply and obey God's word. Real simple. And when we go into a village, usually there will be 10 to 90 people listening to an audio gospel message. And it just amazes me that I would say we probably have at least one person, if not a whole family, to 10 families come to know Christ when we go into a village and take 2 to 8 hours that day to share the whole gospel. Thank you for the cue card. Or we might be here till midnight. Okay. We're not going to have time to tell you all about the children's ministry details, but we've got a great team of Bible story writers who are working with our translators to do the translation. And our goal is to saturate Vietnam the next 10 years. Our goal is to go into 3 new countries starting next year per year. We've mapped out a 10-year program, and only God's going to be able to do what God's put on our heart to do. But we know that God's opened up every door so far. He's provided the funding, the people, the materials, the printing, right down to where even our printer who prints our newsletters for BFA, we've only paid for printing 3 times in 10 years. And I know we've had about $50,000 worth of printing donated right up to even 2 months ago. And God's just blessed us with a wonderful printer, and he's not even a Christian, but he likes what we're doing. Him and his wife both. Okay, I'm going to have to stop this slide because there's a couple of things I want to really share with you. We've seen, as best we can tell, thousands come to Christ. And most of it's oral. But what we have documented in written reports, we know from just the written reports, which reflect about 10%, like in Vietnam, say, just as an example, that we've seen about 7,000 families come to know Christ in the last 3.5 years. We know that they've started close to 7,000 of the audio gospel groups in the last 10 years in Vietnam. But because of the multiplication of people coming to Christ, because of evangelical denominations and their leadership, their believers in their church, their pastors joining with us, it's just helped everything just grow. And really, it just, I'm going to ask you about something. On that table is a lot of different newsletters over the last couple of years, and there's a book. And I want to ask you to really pray about something. I want you to just to pray for, not just pray for Bibles for Asia in God's wisdom and guidance and everything that God has us involved in 10 different ministries, but that this book, Ray Comfort, I think, did most of the writing on this. God has a wonderful plan for your life. It's the myth of the modern day message. If you don't have the book, I would like you to take one. But what's really important is that if you've already read it, or even after you read it, give it to another believer to challenge their heart. It's very stimulating. There's a prayer card in here. And there's also a couple of newsletters in each of these booklets. And there's a little I love you letter from Don begging and asking you to take each one of these newsletters. Think of a believer that you know that God leads you to, and say, could you pray for this organization? Could you pray that we can help them find more leaders for different continents, different countries, and for the USA? We could use about 50 more people right now just in leadership. We could use another couple of thousand to join teams to go over and see what God is doing. And as they go, they can haul things over like laptops, gospel materials, A to Z. We had one of our donors say, well, you know, I'm no longer teaching music and all this. She donated banjos and maracas and all these musical instruments that are now in our Bible school for young and old to enjoy. And they love it. But you know, there's more than one way to reach people for Christ. But here, I'm thinking, I put in here 3 different things. And there's a brochure that talks about the majority of the main ministries of Bibles for Asia. There's one brochure that talks about our feed and seed ministry. Whenever there's a monsoon rain, like a few times every year, I mean, dozens, if not hundreds of lives are lost from drowning in valleys and villages in these tribal areas. And we go there, and our Feed and Seed ministry, we're hauling in usually about 15 to 20 tons of rice during a flood season or after a flood season. We're taking in the gospel stories, and even the police have said, you know, it's illegal for you to do what you're doing, bringing this in and giving it to kids and families, but we're going to not say anything because we thank you for coming in here and feeding these people that are starving to death. During COVID, the same thing. During COVID, when villages were locked down, people couldn't get out to make a living, couldn't get out to farm, and children were starving to death. And we were able to mobilize very quickly, and within 72 hours have food into these villages. And so the Feed and Seed ministry is just growing leaps and bounds like the children's ministry. But we also have a memorial giving ministry where it helps buy audio players and reach villages for Christ. It cost us about $15 to start a gospel listening group after one family or more come to know Christ for the audio player, the microchip, and the printed booklet flip chart that tells the whole good news gospel story. And then from there, our microchips have 6 months to 1 year of Bible teaching depending on their level of understanding. And most of the people that we reach, either about a fourth of them have no written alphabet, so they can't read at all. They're strictly an oral society, and so the audio has become a huge hit. But God's blessing, we're seeing now 2,000 to 3,000 people per month come to know Christ, and that represents usually 700 to 800 families. And when the parents come to know Christ, boy, the children, I mean, it's a family affair. And so please take one of these booklets, read it. I've got 1 minute left. We're out of time. We're on fumes.
We do want to, we'll go into a time of prayer over this.
Well, I'll tell you, please take a book, find 3 people that you know over the next 30 days that will pray for Bibles for Asia, pray for our country, and give them a brochure and ask them to pray. And to just keep multiplying and sharing. But again, I'm used to them 2 to 4 hour village church services.
Not us Americans, huh?
But if you want to get our email, so that if you go paperless, please just take one of these. I'll just leave them here and fill out a little card with your email if you'd like to get that directly, and be happy to add you to that. Joy's the better half, administratively speaking.